Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Feudernick, and the episode you're about to hear about character education was recorded back in 2021 as part of a series we published on our Teacher Stories podcast about what schools can do to help save our democracy. We decided to bring it over to this podcast because, well, it's quite relevant to many of the conversations we've been having here. For example, an episode published in early 2025 is a fascinating conversation I had with the author Brooke Manville about his new book, The Civic Bargain: How Democracies Survive. One condition Manville says is critical to preserving democracy is something he calls civic friendship. And he says civic friendship is something that schools need to cultivate as part of a broader conception of civic education. Well, when I asked Manville about what civic friendship means, he started by explaining what it is not. He said it doesn't mean that you agree with everybody or that you necessarily even like everybody. It means that you're able to get along with others and that people respect one another, even if they have opposing views about things. Manville is essentially arguing for the same thing that my recent guest, Tim Shriver, was promoting in a recent episode about the need for people, starting with young people, to treat each other with dignity rather than contempt. So in my conversation with Manville about democracy, I played a clip from the episode you're about to hear with Marvin Berkowitz and Kashina Bell, who say that character education in schools is A, unavoidable. Kids are developing character, whether teachers mean to teach it or not, and B, that character education is essential to our democratic way of life. I was curious to know whether Manville thought character education might be the way to cultivate civic friendship. Well, you'll have to tune in to my conversation with Manville to hear his answer, but for now, let's get on with the intriguing conversation I had with Dr. Berkowitz and Dr. Bell.
I think the common good as a concept is an endangered species in democracies.
I think it is every leader's individual and collective responsibility as leaders to ensure that schools are democratic environments where kids have voice, they have choice, they have a sense of belonging, and they are always treated with dignity.
And for democracy to move from this band together against the enemy to a collaborative enterprise of searching for the common good, maximizing the good for all, requires the character of the citizens. There is no future without children. There's no moral future without moral children. And there's no democratic future without democratic children.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Teacher Stories. This is your host, Ken Feudernick, with another episode, but this episode is a bit of a departure from our usual stories where we talk to people about teachers and their impact on their lives and on communities. This episode is part of a series we're doing around this question, which we think is timely and important. The question is, what can our schools do to help save our democracy? So we're going to be talking with teachers and experts, policymakers, a whole range of people about that question. But that question presupposes that our democracy is in peril. So I will be asking all of our guests, including the two we have today, whether to weigh in on the premise of that question. So let me introduce today's guests. First, we have Marvin Berkowitz. Dr. Berkowitz is a professor of education at the Center for Character Education at the University of Missouri in St. Louis, and he co-directs the Center for Character Education and Citizenship. We are honored to have one of this country's leading experts on character education. Welcome to Teacher Stories, Marvin.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. And also joining us is Kashina Bell. Dr. Bell is a public school educator, and she serves as Deputy Superintendent for the School District of University City, also in St. Louis. Kashina, welcome to Teacher Stories.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
All right, before we get into what you think schools can do to save our democracy, how concerned are you about the present state of our democracy? Marvin, let's start with you.
Sure. I'm going to even expand that. I'm not just concerned about the state of our democracy. I'm concerned with the state of democracy in general. When this great experiment in self-governance, that is the American democracy, was founded, some really smart people were the architects behind it. And they knew well that the only way self-governance works is if you have people who are citizens of a certain sort. And they needed to be virtuous citizens who are concerned about the common good and had what it takes to be able to go into the public sphere and negotiate and search and debate, try to promote the common good. And so even going back thousands of years, there's classic Greek statements about how character is the destiny of humanity, whether it's a democracy or any other society. So I am concerned about democracies around the world. We see them fraying at the edges and some worse than that. And I think in large part because of the citizenry and because of the character of much of the citizenry.
Well, Christina, let's hear from you. How concerned are you about the present state of our democracy in this country?
I would agree with Marvin, and I would say very concerned with all caps for very. And when I think about democracy, I think about it on several levels, but I will maintain my comments here to that of education. And I will say that in the educational setting, really democracy, I feel, is rooted in voice and choice. And when you have those things and it is cocooned in a sense of belonging and in safety, mental as well as physical safety, that's when democracies thrive.
Well, thanks for responding to that question. I'm concerned about our democracy and have been especially concerned in recent years, especially in what schools can do about strengthening and preserving it. And what concerned me is recently, in recent years, has been the proliferation of fake news and misinformation through social media and other channels that our students are tied into. And it seemed to me especially important that our schools do a particularly effective job at helping students become good critical thinkers, to be well informed. I think it's always been an important goal of education to do that, but it seems especially important now. But it also occurred to me that helping students to become well informed and smart and having a keen intellect does not necessarily mean that students will be good. And so that's why I'm excited to have both of you here to talk about the role that schools can play in developing student character. So Marvin, since you've studied this for a long time, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what character education is about and why you think it belongs in public school settings rather than what some people might think it is something that might happen in churches, synagogues, and mosques or at home. So talk a bit about character education and its role in schools.
See, before you even talk about character education, you have to say, what is character? Because what are we educating for? And that varies widely. Unfortunately, character education is a big umbrella, and there are lots of different positions and theories and approaches to this. And I tend to think of it as the core of a person's inclinations and capacities. So, and these are inclinations and capacities about right and wrong, about ethics, about morality, about goodness. So what is the nature of the person? If we look at you, Ken, what is it about you that leads you to be inclined to do that which is good and ethical? And what is it about you that gives you the capacity to actually do that? And it's a complex set of psychological characteristics. It includes your values, it includes your conscience, it includes your self-concept, and as you suggested, it includes your critical capacity for critical thinking about right and wrong and social issues, relationships, and so on. Um, and that's complicated. So it takes a complicated process to impact that. Certainly, the first and most powerful source of development of that is the family, and particularly parenting. But when people ask the question, is it really the role of schools? Shouldn't it be up to family and faith communities and things like that? And my answer is, one, that would be good if everybody's family and faith community did a competent job at that. But that's not the case, and that's blatantly not the case. And the other part of it, and this is a critical piece for people to understand, is there's no off switch to this. Aristotle said 2,000 years ago that every adult who's around children will impact their character, whether they like it, intend it, or not. There's an ancient Chinese proverb that says every passerby leaves their mark on children. Well, mark is the ancient Greek word for character. I mean, that's where the word character comes from, to leave a mark on something. There's no off switch to this. Every educator impacts kids' character. And what we want is them to do it intentionally and positively and effectively. But to say that I'm going to opt out or it's a choice whether I do it or not is a self-delusion.
And Marvin, might someone say that, what you consider to be good character is not necessarily what I think is good character? Or are there a few common characteristics around this idea of character that probably most of us, if we thought about it, would agree on?
There are two ways to approach the answer to that. One of them is simply to say, yeah, we can get pretty close to consensus. There's always people with odd perspectives and groups with really, fringe perspectives and so on. But generally around the world, and this is not just the US, around the world, we can come up with some common set of agreements about the very basis of character. The basis of character is honesty and reliability, taking responsibility for your actions, treating others justly, and so on. Of course, there are nuances to all this, and it gets complicated. We don't have time to deal with that now. But you can come up with a common core, and you can come up with a common core of prohibitions. It's universally wrong to do harm to another for your own amusement or pleasure, for instance. I don't think there's any system that would say, yeah, no, that we think that's a good thing to do. So you could do that. But the second perspective is more the communal one, to say in your group, whether it's all of America, your part of it, your more local geography, your faith-based community, if you go through a process of fair and open debate and reasoning, in most cases, you can come up with a common core. So many schools bring their communities in to come up with a common set of values. Now, ideally, they should be vetted by an outside group to say, oh, you kind of went off the rails there. That one's really problematic. But it's almost never do you get that. Unless you're dealing with some extreme group or something like that. So I think you can find a common core. And morality is more than the set of values. It's also the processes. Can we be open? Can we deliberate? Can we communicate? Can we negotiate? Can we apply our thinking together to see if we can resolve the differences? We're at a real trouble point with that, as you suggested, with this notion of fake news and lack of truth and divisiveness of those perspectives. And
we're living in what some people refer to as a post-truth world. And, it's one thing to help kids figure out the difference between fake news and real news. But what we've seen in some of our leaders in recent years is a willingness to misrepresent what they know to be true, essentially to lie. And it's become normalized. And I wonder if you think that that kind of behavior, which seems to me to be contrary to the kind of character traits that we would all want, might trickle down to our students. And if so, is there a way that schools can help cultivate character in a way that helps them realize that lying is not a good thing to do. And I guess then the question is, how do you do that? Do you stand up in front of kids and say, you shouldn't lie? That's not a good thing, or is it? So that raises the question: how do you do character education? But talk a little bit about this idea of misrepresenting truth, and put it more directly, just lying, and how schools can deal with that.
Well, if we had an anti-lying pill, we could answer this quickly, but we don't have such a thing. And this is part of a larger question, which is I often get, which is given that the world that these kids live in outside of school gives a countervailing message that teaches them that truth is not important or whatever it might happen to be, why are we even bothering? And one of the answers I give is in that context, you're their only hope. It's more important to do it then than in a place where kids are growing up in communities that are enlightened and aligned with what you want to try to educate for in schools. So we have to do it. But part of the answer to how you do it is it's not character education is more a way of being than it is what we do. They're both important, but the being part gets lost. Kids need to be members of communities that they value and that value them and that embody what we want them to become. So if the community is a caring, inclusive community where children feel safe and wanted and valued, and as Kashina said, there's voice and choice for them in those communities, and those communities also honor truth, embody truth, model truth, then kids start to internalize that. And whether it's strong enough to overcome haranguing parents or neighbors or television shows, that's a toss-up. It depends. But if we don't do that in schools, there's no hope.
So I would say, I think that even if we have not called it that, character has been fundamental in schools probably since the beginning of time. I mean, schools actually were even established to have some type of common learning, some type of common set of knowledge, some type of common ground amongst the individuals that are in that particular space. And those are principles of character, whether we want to say they are or not. It is like Marvin said, the values that everyone in that particular community is going to espouse to, because it's going to make us stronger, richer, healthier. It's going to help us thrive.
And I want to jump in quickly, tell a quick story, which is a powerful one about this. There's a middle school near here that years ago was starting to have a very heavy gang presence. And they brought me in to do a walkthrough, and I did a walkthrough in the school to give them feedback. And they also brought in the former chief of police, and he did a walkthrough. And then we had a meeting later on. And one of the things they had discovered is that attendance was going down during the day because the students had found a door at the back of the school that was supposed to be locked, but it was unlocked. So they were sneaking out. And by the end of the day, attendance had dropped a lot because of the exodus of the students. And so the chief chimed in. He said, well, we can't have that. Kids have to be in school. The solution to this is we have to lock the doors. And I looked at him and I said, Chief, with all due respect, it's not an idea of locking the door. We have to transform this school so it's a place where kids don't want to leave, where they want to be. And that's what Kashina's talking about. It's partly what I'm talking about. And we both have lots of ways that you do that.
I want a related question I have is one of the things that all schools have to deal with, and everyone who's been through school knows this, is that when you have kids who violate certain rules, let's say they bully other kids, there's some schools have adopted zero tolerance policies. If you do this, you're going to be suspended. And so lots of kids get suspended. And the idea is that somehow they'll learn a lesson and they'll come back and won't ever do that again. But we know that that doesn't work very well. So there is this thing called restorative justice. And again, it's schools don't have a choice. They have to do something. They have to respond in some way to behavior that's disruptive and hurtful and harmful. But talk a little bit about this idea of restorative justice. Probably many of our listeners haven't heard of it, and maybe give an example of how it's used and what the benefits might be for what students to learn in schools?
Yeah, I think restorative practices is a great way to go. As I said, character education is largely a way of being, not solely, but largely a way of being. And a big part of the way we be is the way we be with kids in crisis. So there's a behavioral crisis, kids misbehave, done something dangerous or just something wrong. How do we respond? I'm a developmental psychologist. I know how children and adolescents develop. And one of the primary impacts on children's development is how people treat them, particularly people of value and to them and people with power over them. So how does the school treat them in a moment of crisis? And restorative practices is a different way of doing that. Now, there are all sorts of variations on this theme, and so it's hard to overly generalize. But by and large, it's about engaging in dialogue. It's engaging in collaboratively negotiating relevant consequences. So, you broke somebody's property, what ought to happen? You disrespected somebody in public, what ought to happen? I knew one teacher years ago before there was anything called restorative practices, who was an elementary school teacher. And what she taught the kids in the class is when you're caught in the act of doing something like that, I'm going to ask you to go outside the classroom and think about what you could do to fix what you did. And these were 8-year-olds, and they knew it. And the kid would break another kid's pencil or tear up their artwork, and she'd say, "I think you need to go in the hallway and figure out what you need to do." And they knew when they were done with that, they come back in and they stand next to her desk, and she'll say, "Do you have a solution?" And they go, "Yeah." And she wouldn't even ask them what it was. She'd say, "Okay, go take care of it." And they'd go up to the other kid and they say, "I'm really sorry. I tore up your picture. I'll help you do another one," or "I'm sorry I broke your pencil. You can have mine," or whatever it happened to be. And she was doing this well before restorative practices were out there, but it's a much more enlightened way to be. As you noted, Ken, suspensions don't work. Harsh punishments don't work. Zero tolerance doesn't work. What works is motivating kids to try to be better over the long haul.
We know that, and that's why I talked about, the roots of character being in behavior, in some regard, because if you don't do these things, we ostracize you from the community by suspending you. And we know statistics say over and over again, research says over and over again, suspensions do not work. Why do suspensions not work? Well, number one, it just really increases the school to prison pipeline drastically. It increases instances of poverty. It increases instances of crime and personal isolation. And the bottom line is when we think about K-12 education, if a child is suspended, a child is not sitting in a seat accessing the education that is extremely important to them to be able to break all of those other barriers that I just spoke about leading up to this. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand. I've been an educator. I'm going into my 26th year in education. I do understand that there are some infractions of behavior that may rise above what we feel are reasonable to do with rudimentary restorative practices. And so there may have to be some other action that is taken. But even after that action is taken, we should always come back to restore that individual and make them whole again and help them understand that we can bring them back to the community.
I would think both of you would agree that developing character is a really important, worthwhile aim in and of itself. But I wonder if you could talk about the evidence that you're aware of that not only it works to do that, to do the kinds of things you're talking about, but also does it have benefits academically? Are there reasons to think that kids who go through schools that are doing the kinds of things you're talking about
Sure.
benefit in terms of their academic learning?
Well, let me pull back a little bit and say that a good way to think about that in this context is that if you think about what restorative practices means, it means you're bringing back something to a healthier state. Okay, something's been damaged, you're restoring it. Well, if you don't have that healthier state there to begin with, then you can't restore. You can't restore to something that never existed. So character education is trying to create that thing we want to restore to. We want to restore to the kind of community that Kashin is talking about. We want to restore to the way of being that I'm talking about. And There was a report that came out in 2018 from the federal government uh, to try to talk about how do you create safe schools. And they said the basic way you have to start is by doing character education before you start restoring things. You have to, and one of the things they cited was our model, which we call Prime. They have a new book on that one, which just gives 6 basic principles of what you need to create the kind of school you want to restore to. Um, and it's making sure this really is an authentic priority. When Kashina was a principal to school, this was way up there as a top priority, and that's why her school flourished. The other one is relationships. You have to invest in healthy relationships, but you have to be inclusive. You have to be intentional and structural. You have to focus on the internalization of these values and intrinsic motivation, and stop all the craziness about trying to give kids rewards in a way to shape their character. That doesn't shape character.
Marvin, you have to do that not just with kids, but you have to do it with the
Sure.
teachers and the leaders of the schools too, right?
Yeah, because and the fourth idea is modeling, that the adults have to be the character. Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. I say teachers have to be the character they want to see in kids. The E goes back to the choice and the voice and choice that Kashina talked about. We have to create democratic, empowering structures in schools. If we want to socialize kids, what we started with today, to be democratic citizens. John Dewey taught us that. Others have taught us that. It's not enough to teach about democracy. They have to experience being a member in democracy. When we do all those things, yes, there's a lot of evidence that stuff's effective. All of that work that I just talked about came out of reviews of all the research on this. We did a study in California a long time ago of 120 elementary schools that had been lauded for academic achievement, and found that every one of them had a set of core character strategies within them. They were doing character education. We have meta-analyses of data on social emotional learning and character education that show that when you do high quality character education, social emotional learning, and so on, you get bumps in academic achievement. And I'll let Kashina talk about what happened in her school.
When I became principal, I inherited a school that was really forgotten about. It was really in a bad place. Teachers didn't want to be there and kids didn't want to be there. And it was really a very rich opportunity because there was so much there that the individuals who were a part of that community at the time just really could not see. So when I talk about the school culture has to change, that is really where we started. Talk about discipline instances being through the roof. It was crazy. I could give you quantitative data on that, but of course that we don't have time for all of that. Academically, you can imagine where our scores were. They were, our students were grossly underperforming. And in some instances, it was through no fault of their own. In many instances, it was through no fault of their own. In the district where I was principal, there were 5 middle schools. My middle school was at the bottom of those middle schools, and there was a huge gap. So they were kind of clumped together, and we were way at the bottom, all on an island, all by ourselves. So we knew that it was urgent that we do something very quickly. And so we began the process of bringing our system, to Marvin's point, back to health. Restoring us back to health. And that started with culture. So we began with establishing some values, and we called those our Viking values. Those were respect, responsibility, compassion, grit, and integrity. And what happened was we rooted ourselves in a common language to define our collective and individual responsibility to one another as well as to the community. And that was a really rich beginning. To Marvin's point, the adults have to be developed. So we had development for all of the teachers in our building, and that development it surrounded restorative practices, and it also entailed social justice. Our teachers had to be able to see each of our children as human beings with a story and a history and a culture. And we all had to understand and know that we had to respect that culture and ensure that students had dignity to be themselves within who they are. So we had a sixth grade day of service. In the sixth grade day of service, we wanted to ensure that our students were going to be working out of a strong sense of social, personal, and civic responsibility to themselves and the community. So we had students and adults come together to devise a list of activities. I'm just going to read through a few of those activities, but I want to let you know that we had 13 different activities on that day of service, and that was just one grade level. But just a few of the titles were where I'm from. And this was helping older adults tell their stories. So our students visited a senior living center where they worked with the adults to actually share stories about who they are, what their life journey had looked like. And it was a reciprocal approach because the students shared those same stories back with the adults that were in that senior living center. Project Boomerang. That was an idea that came out of from one of our adults, where students created greeting cards for military personnel, and they used recycled paper for that. So they were using some responsibility to the environment there and sustainability as well. Hidden needs, helping people stay warm. Our students studied the essential needs hidden in the community. And one of those needs was warmth. And so the students made blankets and they donated those blankets to the Ronald McDonald House, which is well, they have Ronald McDonald houses, I think, nationwide, but, and the St. Louis Crisis Nursery. Let's see, I'll do one more. This was one that was really, really big. Well, I'll do two more. This was one in particular that was really big for me. They did Fresh Start bags, and the Fresh Start bags supported women as they transition out of homelessness. This is where our students learned that what the items shelters needed in support of women who were trying to move back to independence out of whatever brought them to the state of homelessness or in transition that occurred with them. Our students had to make a budget and they had to go shop for those items. We took them on a journey to shop for those items. And then, of course, those items were donated to the organization that supports the women. But those are the types of things that in this service learning piece were extremely important to bring about a sense of community. And those are the social emotional pieces that I think are important. We started to see tremendous dividends in those pieces of belonging. Our kids were no longer running away from the school. They really wanted to be in school and they began to thrive. Our discipline instances went down and our academic achievement increased. It was extremely rewarding. And our kids still remember that. You know, they remember those experiences. Our teachers still remember those experiences. Those are the things that I think are so important because they change negative trajectories. They can change outcomes for someone long past the middle school experience, but well into adulthood and, you know, into them being parents themselves. So that's what I think fundamentally a school system is for. It was built on democratic principles, and that's what we really should do if we're serving in the proper way.
I think what you've both made really clear is that there are things schools can do to preserve and restore democratic way of life. And a lot of it is about running schools democratically, is running schools the way we would like communities to be and our society to be. And but it does require pausing and saying, what would that look like? How are we treating each other as adults? How do we want to be? And it's not about an add-on to the curriculum. It's not about a new series of lessons or one professional development session that would teach you how to do this. It's really rethinking how it is you want to be as a school community.
Yeah, my simplest model of character education, which is overstating it, is spend a year with the leader of the school, helping them get it, understand it. Kashina is a natural, so it doesn't take a lot. But you know, for some people, it takes more. But to work with that leader, so they really become the instructional leader of character ed and are deeply committed to it and committed to being that kind of a leader. And we do a lot of work now on the characteristics of a leader who can do this. We use servant leadership and the virtues of servant leadership. The second step, and this is the most important under-leveraged piece in all of this, is that leader now has to shepherd an adult culture that's appropriate for this kind of work. And We don't train leaders to do this. They don't know they're supposed to do it. They certainly don't know how to do it. Everybody's frightened by the idea of dealing with the adults. But if you don't do that, there's a ceiling on how far you ever go. And then the last step is finally now you can roll it out for kids. Once you got a leader who gets it and can do it, and you've got the correct adult culture there. So the adults are all on board in the right way and treat each other in the right way.
Just real quickly, while I'm just following up on what you said, Marvin, for those listening that think, boy, I would love to do what you've talked about and what Kashina's talking about. I don't know what steps to take, and I don't want you to go through the answer to that, but if you would send me some resources, I will include it in the description of this podcast episode and some links to websites where they can learn more, because I suspect there are people out there that say, you've convinced me. I don't like the climate at our school, and I am committed to the kinds of things you're talking about, but I don't know what to do, and I want to learn more. So I would hope that you would share with me some resources that I can share with our listeners. I think we're getting to the point where we probably should sign off, and I just want to ask both of you if you have a final thought you want to share about the connection between character education and the state of our democracy.
I think that what's happened with our democracy and democracies around the world is we've lost our way in terms of what democracy is. As I said earlier, democracy is supposed to be a collaborative enterprise where we come together in the common sphere, searching for the common good across differences in a way that's effective, that maximizes the greater good for the greatest number of the people. And I think the common good as a concept is an endangered species in democracies. We've lost the sense of what the common good is. And democracies have sort of devolved into a mathematical enterprise where everybody votes for self-interest, or votes out of fear, or votes out of hatred and bigotry, out of ignorance, but for something that I want, and whoever has the most wins. That never was supposed to be what democracy is. And for democracy to move from this band together against the enemy and see if we can accrue more votes than them, to a collaborative enterprise of searching for the common good, maximizing the good for all, requires the character of the citizens. And if churches and families and others and so on could do that alone, fine. They can't, they don't, they won't, they do some of it, but we all need to be involved in it. And on top of that, as I said earlier, we all impact it anyhow. So we can't put our heads in the ground and ignore the fact that teachers who are doing things that are not in the best interest of children, that they're not somehow affecting negatively the character of kids. We know they do. Every teacher who's had multiple classrooms feeding into their classroom knows that they can tell which teacher a kid had the previous year without ever looking at a list of that. And so deny the fact that every teacher impacts the character of kids is just lying to yourself and undercutting the quality of the world in which we all have to live. I mean, ultimately, our students will be our coworkers and our neighbors and the people who take care of us. You know, as George Benson wrote, you know, I think he wrote it, I believe the children are the future. Not a matter of belief, it's a matter of fact. There is no future without children. There's no moral future without moral children. And there's no democratic future without democratic children. So character education is a critical piece of all that. And I think we have to, you know, accept it and then leverage it for the good.
Marvin, thank you for that. Kashina, final thoughts?
Yes, I think that when we think about the challenges to our democracy, we all need to be concerned. I think that we should all wake up and be vigilant because it's very important, particularly in all aspects of our life. But I would say particularly in education, because education is where you form the foundation that begins to shape some of the events that are going to happen in the rest of your life. I agree with Marvin that I think character is fundamental to that. We can't run from character being an essential piece of that. Our character is judged on our jobs. Our character is judged amongst our friends. Our character is judged in our amongst our relatives. So, there's no escaping the fundamental importance of character and or character education. Character education fundamentally is just increasing your knowledge and understanding of character. You are the individual that has to be introspective enough to look at where you are and where you want to be, and what you show others and what you don't show others, and find the blending of those two. Um, I think that it is, as far as a democracy and character in schools, I think it is every leader's individual and collective responsibility as leaders to ensure that schools are democratic environments where kids have voice, they have choice, and they have safety with their voice and their choice. They have a sense of belonging, and they are always treated with dignity.
Thank you, Kashina and Marvin, for being part of Teacher Stories and weighing in on this really important question about what schools can do to help save our democracy. And I think you've touched upon an aspect that is too often ignored. It's we think of schools as being a place where we help kids become smart and well informed, and they will be productive and successful, but we often ignore what is really at the very heart of our democracy, which is how do we want to treat one another? How do we want to be with one another? So I just want to thank you for sharing your experiences and the work that you've done in this area. And Teacher Story listeners, if you've enjoyed this, we've added a new feature on our website where you can actually submit your comments and raise questions and have dialogue about this particular episode and any of our other episodes. So I'd urge you to go to teacherstories.org, subscribe if you want to hear about future episodes and get our newsletter. We'll have other episodes in this series on democracy in schools. It will focus on civic education and critical thinking and navigating fake news and several other topics related to this question. And so I hope you will tune into that and be part of the Teacher Stories community. So I think with that, I'm going to sign off again, thanking Marvin Berkowitz from University of Missouri, and Kashina Bell, also from St. Louis, as a school administrator there. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye, Marvin.
Bye-bye. Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, bye, Kashina.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much for having me.